Hey, what is up guys, Mergaman4 here, and today I'm back to review another release in the collection, this time Season 15. Tom Baker's era is now well underway, and with it we have the first season produced by Graham Williams, as well as the last to be script edited by Robert Holmes. So, how does this new chapter for the Fourth Doctor fare? Let's find out. I've mentioned it before, I'm not the biggest fan of this era of Doctor Who. Especially coming off the back of the Hinchcliffe years, which are amongst the best the show has ever seen, I tend to find the Williams era lackluster. Not bad, but lacking that special spark that most other eras carry. But as always, I'll be entering the season with an open mind, and perhaps I'll walk away surprised. Either way, let's kick things off with the season's premiere, Horror of Fang Rock. Well, we're going to be starting this off with an unpopular opinion. I don't think Horror of Fang Rock is all that special. In fact, in my books, it's a strong contender for most overrated story of all time. Now, before you crucify me, let me clarify. This is a good story. The Lighthouse is a wonderfully atmospheric setting, there's a good guest cast, and it's fun to finally put a face, so to speak, to the name Rutan. But I don't know, despite liking a lot of elements to this story, I simply don't love any of it. And to be perfectly honest, I actually feel the ship crash and subsequent doubling of the cast is probably to the story's detriment. Not that I think they're bad, but I don't really think they add anything either, and I probably would have preferred it had the story just kept it to the small lighthouse crew instead. Especially since most of the deaths are saved for the final part anyway. Additionally, I find it kind of odd that the Rutan has shapeshifting abilities, the perfect plot device for such an isolated setting, and yet the story never really takes advantage of it. Sure, the Rutan inhabits the form of Reuben, but it spends most of that time keeping out of sight and the rest of it not exactly being subtle. Like I said, I still enjoy the story, but I feel like there's quite a bit of wasted potential here, and as a result, I don't think it's really any better than your average Doctor Who story. Which isn't a bad thing, your average Doctor Who story is still pretty good, but I guess it can feel a lot more disappointing when said story is frequently considered by others to be an all-time classic. Either way, sorry to say, but Horror of Fang Rock won't be getting any higher than a 7 out of 10 from me. I feel like this is a story that often gets a lot of flack, and I can't really say it's unwarranted. In true Bob Baker and Dave Martin fashion, there are a lot of great ideas that the script either fails to take full advantage of, or are far too ambitious for the show to achieve effectively. Or perhaps a combination of both. But despite some of the story's infamously shoddy moments, I can't lie. It's perfectly entertaining in its own right. Conceptually, I really like the core of the story, a microscopic being infecting and taking over others to breed more of its kind, with the solution being to shrink down and battle it at its own scale. It's a lot of fun to literally get into the Doctor's head, and while the budget struggled enough as it is, I kinda wish we got to spend more time there. I also think the build-up as the swarm takes over the Titan base and then invades the hospital works fairly well, and the Doctor succumbing to the infection adds an extra layer of tension. We've also got some entertaining guest performances from the likes of Frederick Yeager and Michael Sheard, and of course, this story is also the debut of K9. I know some find the character annoying, but I've always loved him, and it's a brilliant introduction. It's easy to see why they decided to make him a regular character. All in all, The Invisible Enemy is a mixed bag. It's got plenty of flaws, but it does enough right that I can forgive most of them. All told, The Invisible Enemy will be getting a 6.5 out of 10 from me. Image of the Fendahl is a weird one. I don't think the plot has all that much to it, and every time I watch it, the details of the story don't seem to stick in my mind for long. But at the same time, wow, is this just dripping with atmosphere. And regardless of how much, or how little, sticks with me after the fact, I always remember that I enjoyed it. And this rewatch was much the same. I can't claim to fully understand how Steele thought things were going to play out, or how exactly the Fendahl works, or why Theo was connected to the skull, But what I do know is that the characters are fun to watch, there's a lot of memorable imagery, and this story goes to some dark places that it's kind of shocking the show got away with. I mean, one week you've got a wobbly, oversized shrimp that's impossible to take seriously, and a couple weeks later, you have the Doctor helping someone commit suicide. And that's the thing, really. Image of the Fendahl isn't a story you watch for the plot. You watch it for the experience. And as far as experiences go, it's a pretty good one. So for that, I'll be giving it an 8 out of 10. You gotta love Robert Holmes. Who would have thought a story about taxes could be this fun? And that's exactly the word to describe the Sunmakers. It's a solid story in its own right with some brilliant political commentary, but the humor is what takes it to another level. And unlike much of the Williams era where I find the silliness often feels like it's trying a bit too hard, Holmes' work is effortless. I had a grin on my face from start to finish. In particular, I adore the characters of Gatherer Hade and the Collector, neither of whom one could describe as subtle, but then the Sunmakers isn't a subtle story, and it's all the better for it. To be honest, I tend not to recall much of the citizens living underground aspect, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it on rewatch. I still think it's completely outshined by the villains of the piece, but yeah, it's solid, and of course it's immensely satisfying to see them successfully rise up against their oppressors by the end. On the whole, this is just a magnificently fun 90 minutes, which is why it gets an easy 8 out of 10 from me. What can I say about Underworld that hasn't already been said? I mean, there's no getting around it. This is considered one of the worst Doctor Who stories of all time, and I can't disagree. Like The Invisible Enemy before it, this is another case of a Baker and Martin story being far more interesting in concept than execution. But unlike that story, everything in the production seems to be working against Underworld. To its credit, the first episode is actually alright. There's a really great idea here about another species being given the Time Lord's gift of regeneration, though this is sadly hardly explored and quickly forgotten about, and I like the idea of an eternal quest in the hope of saving their species from extinction. Unfortunately, once we get into the caves in part 2, everything just collapses. Honestly, I can look past the poor visual effects, bad though they are. What I can't get past is the interminable repetition, long, boring shots of people walking through the same cave system again and again and again. Sometimes you'll even have the same image being used to represent 2 different camera angles, which leads to immense visual confusion. And while I don't mind characters from part 1, especially Alan Lake's Herrick, who I genuinely loved watching throughout the whole story, everyone from the P7E is just so bland and uninteresting. It's a real struggle to care about anything that's going on, and it's one of the few stories that I wholeheartedly agree deserves its negative reputation. Herrick and the story's beginning manage a little bit of damage control, but it's not much. I'll be giving Underworld a 2.5 out of 10. The Invasion of Time is a constantly evolving experience for me. By which I mean, every time I watch it, I seem to have a radically different opinion. In 2016, I loved it and gave it an 8.5. In 2020, I was less than fond, giving it a 4. This time around, I've fallen somewhere in between. I think in large part this is because, in concept, I do think Invasion of Time is brilliant. I love the idea of the Doctor orchestrating an invasion of Gallifrey as part of a devious plan to defeat the villains, with us and the Companion being left in the dark as to his true intentions. I love the idea of the story playing out as a standard 4-parter, only for the climactic victory to be hijacked by a far more dangerous enemy. But where the story falls down is in the execution, both in terms of the script and the production itself. Generally, I do enjoy the first 4 parts, but the Doctor himself is far and away the most interesting aspect. Gallifrey just doesn't have the same level of excitement and intrigue it did in the previous season's The Deadly Assassin, and while Leela certainly does her best to fight back, I feel like the script kind of forces her into a position where she can't really do much. Then, in come the Sontarans, and we get a 2-episode runaround and a TARDIS that doesn't look like a TARDIS, and Sontarans that are clumsy, ineffective, and downright silly. I'm also not a big fan of how the Doctor is forced to use the DMAC gun and abandon his principles to save the day, but doesn't actually give him any conflict about it, even going so far as to erase his memory of pulling the trigger. And the less said about Leela's abysmal exit, the better. I mean, I love the way the Doctor handles it. That cut to him closing the TARDIS doors and the joyful facade dropping away in an instant is brilliant. But this is the nadir of the companion leaving to be married off to someone they just met trope. So, yeah, very much a mixed bag. Lots of stuff I love, lots of stuff I don't. This time, I think I'm going to go pretty much right in the middle with a 6 out of 10. An underwhelming conclusion to the season. So unfortunately, I don't think I'm walking away from this season with a greater appreciation than before. There's certainly stuff I enjoy here, but very little I can say I love, and it's the start of, in my opinion, the longest stretch of just okay the show has ever had. Tom Baker continues to be great, and Louise Jameson does her best with the material, though I think she was much better served in her debut season, and K9's a pretty fun addition to the TARDIS crew, but even still, this is the kind of season that I don't see myself revisiting outside of full rewatches. So with that said, let's take a look at how Season 15 stacks up against the other seasons I've reviewed so far. Within the season, The Sunmakers comes out on top with an 8 out of 10. Close behind is Image of the Fendahl, also with an 8, followed by Horror of Fang Rock with a 7, The Invisible Enemy with a 6.5, The Invasion of Time with a 6, and finally Underworld with a 2.5 out of 10. Altogether, Season 15 receives an average score of 6.33, putting it in 11th place and tying it with the other Graham Williams season I've reviewed. This decreases the average score of the 1970s to 7.01 out of 10, with Tom Baker's era dropping back below John Pertwee's with a new average of 7.07. As for Season 15's writers, in 5th and 6th place are Chris Boucher and Robert Holmes, both with an average of 8.17. Following them are Terrence Dicks in 12th place with 7.63, and Graham Williams moving down to 13th with 7.5. Another pair comes in the form of Dave Martin and Bob Baker in 31st and 32nd place, and both with an average of 6 out of 10. Finally, Anthony Reed climbs up one place to 37th with a new average of 4.5 out of 10. In the producers' ranking, Graham Williams remains in last place with an unchanged average of 6.33. Robert Holmes' role as script editor in the season's first half keeps him in 3rd place with 7.57, while Anthony Reed enters the script editor ranking in last place with an average of 4.25. Finally, in terms of directors, George Spenton Foster enters the list with an 8 out of 10, putting him in 10th place, followed by Pennant Roberts with an increased average of 7.63, then Patty Russell enters in 22nd place with a score of 7, Derek Goodwin in 28th with a score of 6.5, Gerald Blake in 30th with a score of 6, and finally Norman Stewart in the bottom spot with Underworld's 2.5 out of 10. Looking at the premieres I've reviewed so far, Horror of Fang Rock enters around the middle in 9th place, while The Invasion of Time similarly enters the finale ranking in 10th. Unfortunately, Season 15 contributes no new entries to the top 10, but Underworld enters the bottom 10 strong, second from the bottom. In the full ranking, The Sunmakers comes 21st, Image of the Fendahl 30th, Horror of Fang Rock 48th, The Invisible Enemy 57th, The Invasion of Time 66th, and finally Underworld in 85th, out of a total of 86 stories. And that concludes my review of Season 15. Unfortunately, the start of what is, in my opinion, the weakest run of Doctor Who to date. However, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't without its highlights. I'll happily give The Sunmakers or Image of the Fendahl a rewatch anytime. But what do you think about Season 15? Love it? Hate it? Let me know in the comments below. And with that, Murgaman4 over and out, and I'll see you guys later.